Good afternoon. How are you doing? So I'm here to talk to you about design thinking. Actually, I'm here to share with you what I learned about design thinking from the students who took my classes in the last 20 years. I have been fortunate to teach 2 classes that, by all metrics, they are quite successful, based on student interest, enrollment, and what our students are doing after they finish those classes. The first class is a class called Biodesign Innovation. This is a class I designed jointly with 2 physicians from Stanford Medical School, Paul Yock, who invented the key technology that is used in balloon angioplasty, and Josh McHauer, who invented the technique and a device that is used for sinuplastic surgery. They both were inventors and successful medical device entrepreneurs, and they wanted to design a course to teach physicians, engineers, and MBAs how to develop new medical devices. We met through a connection of an ex-student. Most of the things that I do in life that have an impact involve my ex-student, as you have heard from Drew. And we met, and then I told them, I'm from Stanford Business School. I know about health economics and healthcare systems. Do you want to partner together and develop a course? And we did. And we developed a process. We ended up codifying that in a textbook that is used in every bioengineering program in the country. And the key premise of the course is that we get teams to work on unmet medical needs. We take a group of fellows, we put them at Stanford Hospital for 3 months, they identify unmet medical needs, and then over a period of 2 quarters, they figure out whether they can turn those needs into medical devices and companies. And it kind of worked. These are companies that came out of that course over the past 10 years. Many of them have products in clinical practice. One of them went public, and I will talk about that in a second. The other class that I teach is a class called Startup Garage. 2-quarter class for MBAs to help them build new businesses. We do something different in Startup Garage. We are industry agnostic. So I can have one team that is working on improving primary care for Medicaid patients, and I have another team that is developing sex toys. They actually do these things in the same class, and they are learning from each other. And it also works. 135 of those projects became real companies in the past 6 years. They raised a little bit more than $3 billion in funding. What both of those classes have in common is intense, I would say, obsession on who the business is serving. Who is the user? Who is the customer? How do you create value? Now, you may get a little bit scared here. You have this professor coming from Silicon Valley, and he may tell you what Silicon Valley people say, move fast and break things. Wait a second. This is healthcare. You don't want me to break things. Because in healthcare, those of you who are clinicians had to take an oath. First, do no harm, which comes from Latin, primo non nocere, which actually comes from Greek, and I have to say that because I'm Greek, ophelin imi vlaptin. So Hippocrates talked about what criteria could guide clinical decision making. And he said there are 2 criteria. The first one is make things better. The second one is do not make things worse. Well, how about doing both? Making things better without making things worse. So this is what I tell my students when they take my classes. Do not move fast and break things. The last thing that I want to see is an embarrassing story about your startups on the front page of the New York Times. Please do not be the next Theranos. Please don't. Move deliberately and fix things. And how do you do that? By following a process. And be slow. How many of you have used DoorDash? That was a project in my class, 2012. Team of 4, they wanted to create a business to help small businesses make more money. They said, okay, how do we do that? The first assignment in the class, which is the first assignment that Drew had to do, is go out of the building and talk to who you think is your customer. So they went out of the building and they started doing interviews. They did 10 interviews. Nothing was clicking. 20 interviews. Nothing was coming out. 65th interview. 65 interviews, the 65th one. They visit a bakery store that makes amazing macaroons in Menlo Park. The lady who had the store told them that every week she had to turn down about 20 orders because they needed delivery, but she couldn't deliver. She didn't have a way to deliver. And they had their insight. What if we could enable small bakeries and restaurants offer delivery? Then they decided to understand why can't they do that. The first question they asked themselves is, what restaurant offers a good delivery service? Domino's. So what did they do? They signed up as Domino's drivers. That was part of their assignment. They got course credit for doing that. And they recognized that Domino's had a good model, very consumer-friendly. They had an app that they designed the same year that the iPhone got out that enabled placing an order through the app. But they had a problem. Some weeks, the drivers were sitting idle, doing nothing. Other weeks, they were so busy, all the pizzas would be late. Now, nobody likes a stale pizza. Nobody likes a pizza that is not crusty. So managing that variability in demand is something that was hard to do. So they said, who is really good at managing that variability in demand with deliveries? FedEx. They signed up to become FedEx drivers. They drove FedEx trucks for a month. They found that FedEx was using advanced algorithms to figure out how to manage demand and how to manage its routes. And of course, being in Silicon Valley, they used Uber. So their insight was, what if we combine Uber, FedEx, and Domino's and create a delivery service for small restaurants? And they started testing it in my class. And it worked out. They figured out the economics. After 6 months, they raised their first round of funding. Over a period of 4 years, they raised $2 billion. So out of the $3.5 billion that I mentioned earlier, $2 billion came out of DoorDash. Eventually, they went public, and they now have a market capitalization of $30 billion. iRhythm, this came out of biodesign. The Holter monitor that is used for heart arrhythmias was designed 40 years ago. It's big, like an old Walkman with 20 electrodes. You go to the doctor, they give it to you, they explain how to wear it, you put all the electrodes around. If you're going to have a shower, you have to take it off and wear it again. And this thing is supposed to pick up if you have arrhythmias. Most patients get so frustrated, they take it out after a day. There are too many false negatives. The team involved an electrophysiologist and an electrical engineer and an MBA. They thought, what if we can use new electronics to condense the electronics in this old Walkman? This is how much electronics they needed to make that happen, like a quarter. Develop new material so that patients can put the patch on them, and they don't need to take it out when they go and have their shower. And let's deliver this to their patient in the mail and have the patient send it back to the doctor in the mail instead of having them go and see the doctor for just getting the patch. They tested it in the class. They raised funding. They went public. Hundreds of thousands of patients are using that technology. Now, what both iRhythm and DoorDash have in common is they were very deliberate in understanding the customer and the need. And that is the essence of design thinking. I'm not a designer. I have very little artistic intuition, but I teach design thinking because design thinking is about a structured way of understanding your customer and their needs. So this is the process that I teach in my class. It begins with deep empathy, getting engaged and immersed in the environment of your customer and your user, understanding all the observations that you're getting and organizing it, developing a point of view about the problem you are going to solve, ideating solutions, testing them with low-resolution prototypes, and iterating them. Behind all of this, what I've learned is that innovation is not an event. Innovation is a process. It's a design process. And strong design processes induce startling, unexpected, creative accidents that create beauty, that make the world better. And design thinking is a mindset. It's a mindset that involves bias for action. Neither the DoorDash team nor the iRhythm team identified their need by reading a textbook or by listening to experts. They got out of the building. They talked to the real experts, the people. They were biased to move forward. It involved talking to strangers. None of them knew what was the problem that they really wanted to solve or what the solution would be. They had the confidence to jump into the deep end of the pool and learn that eventually they're going to swim and they're going to figure it out. And it involved a lot of wondering. I remember sitting with both teams in my office and hearing about all the challenges that they were facing and brainstorming different ways to overcome them. With the Irish team, countless hours to understand the economics of the healthcare system and how to make their business model work. 6 months until they figured out how to make the payment work. It involves engaging and connecting with people, listening to their stories. Everyone has a story to tell. 20 orders per week that I cannot deliver. That's the story that became the beginning of DoorDash. No judging. Why can't you do that? Don't you have the time? Why is it that possible? Questioning everything. And prototyping. Prototyping early to fail and learn. But again, healthcare is special. It makes things more interesting and more complicated. In order for an innovation to be successful in healthcare, it has to accomplish 4 things. It has to be usable by everyone involved in that innovation. It has to be feasible, the technology needs to work. It has to be viable, the economics need to make sense. And it has to be approvable by the regulators. For a lot of drugs, we know that, okay, if you cure cancer, there is going to be a market there, so you don't need to worry about viability. If it's a really critical disease and patients are desperate, usability is not front of mind, so we end up focusing a lot on feasibility and approvability. But the world is changing. Patients have to navigate very complex environments when going through care. You want the patient care to be as seamless as possible. Usability is important. The economics change. Also, in healthcare, who is the user? Who is benefiting from an innovation? I'm putting the patient at the top. Patient-centric care, patient-centric clinical trial. That's why you don't want to move fast and break things in healthcare. You don't want to break patients. You want to make things better for patients that are at the top. But there are caregivers, family that supports them, physicians, physician assistants that make care possible. And then for clinical trial, there are the investigators, the site administrators, the sponsors, the regulators, the payers. There are 10 potential users here. 10. How do you choose? How do you prioritize? The first thing you do is cast a wide net. Think that if the patient is at the center, the patient is connected to a social network. Trace the social network, who is involved in their care. You're going to learn it all from that. And then how do you prototype? For that, given the amazing stage that the whole team put together, I like to draw a lesson from Broadway. Every time there is a new Broadway show, what happens before the show? Rehearsals. What happens before the rehearsals? Workshops. They take the script, break it down into small parts, and they go and test these small parts with a small audience to get feedback and iterate, to learn about how the story resonates with the audience, but to learn also how to interact with each other on stage. And that's a prototype. So now we can take both of those and see how we can apply them in clinical trials. So this is a case study. Phase 2 clinical trial on a drug that I cannot pronounce, we're going to call it OP, for patients with cirrhosis who are hospitalized for acute hepatic encephalopathy. Now, the protocol. The patient appears in the emergency room, has to be diagnosed by a physician, has to wait for 12 hours for current standard of care to see whether that works, and after 12 hours, if it's not working, you have to diagnose how severe the hepatic encephalopathy is, and if it's above a particular stage in the health diagnosis, then they are eligible for the trial. You have to enroll them in the trial. Then you have to evaluate them 3 times a day. And if within the first 5 days there is an improvement, you have shown efficacy. So They launch the trial, biotech company, their stock shoots up the minute they say they launch the trial, and then nobody's enrolling, nobody's signing up, and you have to disclose that to investors, and the stock is dropping. And the chief medical officer goes and visits sites, and she figures out that, first, you cannot get informed consent from a patient who is in coma after 12 hours when their family may be away and trying to work. Second thing is, the investigator is a hepatologist, but everything happens in the emergency room. And if you are in a big academic hospital, most physicians do not talk to each other if they are separated between different divisions. And then the response needs to be evaluated using this specialized instrument. And if you don't have enough people doing that, you cannot do 3 evaluations per day. But then they're scared to move because they will have to change the protocol. Eventually, they had to do it. And they figured it out. They figured out that they had to move the sites from big academic centers to community centers where the hepatologists and the emergency room physicians knew each other. They figured out that they needed to change the evaluation from 3 times a day to 2 times a day at the beginning and end of a shift so that the same nurse would do it, and then enrollment went up. But in the process, the stock tanked and it never recovered. So, how could you use design thinking to avoid 1 year of learning under fire how to make the protocol work better? I like to call it battle test your protocol by observing and interviewing and by prototyping. Move slowly at the beginning so you can move faster later on. Spend some time in the early stages of designing your protocol, going to the sites, interviewing key personnel in the sites, also talking to patients, patient advocacy groups. Try to map what I like to call the patient user journey. What is the patient experience and how would that integrate with the protocol? And try to look for the friction points and try to anticipate what those friction points are and how to address them. Now, big friction point, regulation. Last week, I was teaching a program for a major pharmaceutical company. I was talking to them, sharing the story that I would share with you today. And they told me one of the biggest innovations they did in clinical discovery was when they started looking into regulators, not as obstacles, but part of the solution. And bringing in regulatory affairs very early on in the design process to understand what the obstacles are and help them be part of the solution. That's the observe and interview part. Is it easy? No. But understanding everyone's goals as you're putting together a clinical trial protocol can help you anticipate issues that will show up later when you have patients enrolling. Now, I'm not saying design a protocol and go into a site and start enrolling patients. Borrow from Broadway, workshop it. Run the protocol with fake patients. Now, what is a fake patient? In medical schools, how are medical students learning how to diagnose patients and treat patients? First, they do it on patient actors. At Stanford Hospital, we have a group of patient actors that every medical student treats to learn how to conduct a medical service. So you can take your protocol, you can break it down, and you can test it with actors. You can test it with a fake IRB, that their own purpose is to give them feedback, not to approve it. Different IRB than the IRB that is going to approve the protocol. Now, you may say that's expensive. Not as expensive as seeing your stock price drop by 70% because of issues that happen during a clinical trial design. Not as expensive as hurting a patient who is going through a clinical trial. Not as expensive as delaying the enrollment of a patient who would benefit from a life-saving procedure. So observing and interviewing and prototyping can make a big difference. And that can lead into a virtuous cycle where you empathize first, you design, you prototype, you learn how to reduce the risk, and you circle back. So I want to leave you with some concrete things. How do you become a designer as you are designing clinical trials? Take bias for action to overcome bias for inaction. You can always change things, and it's much easier to change things earlier as opposed to later. Start with something small. Pick a site, observe and interview a few patients. Prototype. Test your protocol in a workshop. Pick a small workshop that you're comfortable with to learn how to do these things, and then learn and adapt. Learn how to design by testing how you can use design thinking and small elements of design thinking in the next clinical trial you're designing. Because at the end of the day, this is all about getting life-saving care into the hands of patients, into the bodies of patients as early as possible. And for that, you really want to move deliberately and slowly and make things better. So move slowly at the beginning, use principles of design thinking and empathy to avoid some of the challenges that they may appear later on. Thank you.